The dust never truly settled. Not really. It was a permanent feature of the world now, a fine gray powder that coated everything in a shroud of what used to be. It was in my lungs, in the lines of my hands, in the silence that hung between the skeletal remains of skyscrapers. They called it the haze, the weapon that had ended the world, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It hadn't just killed, it had erased. It seeped into the mind, scouring away memories, personality, love, and hate, leaving behind only a blank, twitching canvas of a person, an echo. The hegemony, the architects of our fall, had unleashed it and then retreated behind their sealed borders, leaving us to rot in the ruins of our own minds. I was a medic before the fall, trained to mend flesh and bone. Now, I was a scavenger, picking through the bones of a dead city, leading a crew that was more family than I had left. Every time I looked at the gray sky, I saw my brother's eyes. Leo, younger than me by 5 years, his face full of a light that the world had no right to extinguish. He hadn't died. He had simply faded. I watched him become an echo, his gaze turning vacant, his hand slipping from mine as he wandered into the haze, drawn by a call only the lost could hear. That was the part of me that had been scoured away, the part that still screamed in the quiet hours of the night. We had learned to survive, to navigate the streets where the echoes shuffled in mindless herds, to avoid the hegemony cleanser patrols that stalked the gray zones in their sterile white environmental suits. They weren't conquerors, they were exterminators, carrying pulse rifles that turned echoes and survivors alike into drifts of finer, darker ash. They were ghosts in their own right, silent, implacable, and utterly without mercy. Our destination was a sanctuary, a place whispered about on scavenged radios, a myth we chased for a month through collapsed highways and poisoned subways. It was called the Archive, a repurposed subterranean library where a small community had found a way to not just survive, but live. We weren't seeking refuge, we were traders. Our crew had a stash of pre-fall antibiotics, a currency more valuable than gold. And the Archive had something we needed, a working hydroponics water purifier. But the real treasure of the Archive, the secret they guarded with their lives, was the children. There were 24 of them, born after the haze, all inexplicably immune. They were the last bright sound in a world gone silent, their laughter echoing through the dusty halls lined with forgotten books. They were hope, a fragile, impossible flower blooming in the concrete dust. Their existence was a refutation of everything the hegemony had done to us. They were the future, a future that could walk under the gray sky without fear of being erased. I found myself watching them, a hollow ache in my chest where Leo's memory lived. A little girl with hair the color of rust and a smile that could have cracked stone showed me a picture book, her small finger tracing the image of a blue bird. I hadn't seen a real bird in a decade. We were sharing a meal with the community's elder, a woman named Alara whose face was a roadmap of the world's pain. When the first tremor hit, it wasn't an earthquake. It was the rhythmic, percussive thud of a breaching charge. The cleansers came in silence, no shouts, no warnings, just the hiss of hydraulics and the sterile white of their suits against the dim light of the library. They moved with a chilling efficiency, sweeping through the halls, their pulse rifles already raised. Alara stood, her voice cracking as she pleaded, shouting that these were children, that they were harmless, that they were immune. The lead cleanser, distinguished by a black stripe on his helmet, simply raised his rifle and fired. Laura dissolved into a cloud of black dust that settled on the nearby bookshelves. Panic erupted. The children screamed. The community fought back with salvage pipes and desperate courage, but it was a slaughter. The hegemony didn't see people. They saw a biological contamination, a loose end to be sterilized. I grabbed the little girl with the rusty hair and shoved her behind me, my medic's kit feeling impossibly useless. I threw saline packs, scalpels, anything I could reach, but it was like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. I saw a father shield his son, both of them vanishing in a silent flash of blue energy. I saw a teenage boy, no older than Leo had been, charge forward with a metal rod, only to be cut down without a second thought. The air filled with the smell of ozone and burning dust. A pulse blast caught my side, searing through my jacket and flesh, throwing me into a row of metal shelving. Books rained down on me, their pages fluttering like dying moths. Through the haze of pain and the ringing in my ears, I saw the commander with the black stripe corner, a small group of children cowering in the history section. He raised his rifle, the weapon's energy cell humming with a sound that would haunt me forever. Then he paused. He lowered the rifle and unslung a canister from his back. He wasn't going to shoot them. He was going to use the haze, a concentrated dose, to erase them right in front of me, to turn their bright, innocent minds into the same blank void that had taken my brother. Something inside me didn't just break. It detonated. I surged to my feet, the pain in my side a distant fire, and charged. I didn't have a weapon, only a fury so pure and absolute it felt like it could melt steel. I slammed into the commander, sending the canister skittering across the floor. My momentum carried us both through a set of rotting wooden doors and into a maintenance corridor. His helmeted head struck the concrete wall with a sharp crack. He was dazed, just for a second, but it was enough. I scrambled for the only weapon I could see, a heavy, rusted fire extinguisher. I brought it down on his helmet, again and again, the white shell cracking, then splintering. I didn't stop until the rhythmic thud was replaced by a wet, sickening crunch. My crew found me there, standing over the twitching, ruined body, my breath coming in ragged sobs. The silence in the archive was absolute. Of the 24 children, we found only 3 alive, hidden in a ventilation duct, their faces streaked with tears and dust. The little girl with the rusty hair was one of them. We carried their trembling bodies back through the ruins of the city, every step an exercise in white-hot agony, both from my wound and from the inferno in my soul. Back in our enclave, the council preached the same tired sermon: caution, restraint, do not provoke them. They spoke of survival as if it were enough, as if breathing in this gray world was the same as being alive. But I had seen the hegemony's true face, not as soldiers, but as gardeners weeding a lawn, utterly indifferent to the lives they snuffed out. They didn't just want us dead, they wanted us forgotten, erased from the world as if we had never been. My grief for Leo, a long, cold ache, had finally found a companion, a burning, relentless rage. I started to gather the others, the ones who, like me, had seen enough. We met in the husks of burnt-out buildings, in forgotten subway tunnels, in the places where the council's hollow words couldn't reach. There was Jax, a former engineer whose wife had been taken by a cleanser patrol. There was Maya, a scout who had watched her settlement get sterilized from a nearby rooftop. We were a collection of broken pieces, united by the scars the hegemony had left on our souls. We didn't want survival anymore. We wanted retribution. My medical knowledge, once a tool for healing, twisted into something new. I knew what chemicals reacted, what compounds were volatile, what parts of the body were most vulnerable. The cleansers thought the haze was their weapon, that the gray zones were their domain. They were wrong. The haze was our home. We knew its currents, its densities, its dead zones, and we would teach them to fear it. Our first target was a remote atmospheric monitor, one of the many stations the hegemony used to track haze concentrations. It was a simple job, nothing glorious. 3 of us, cloaked in rags that mimicked the echoes, slipped through the perimeter under the cover of a dust storm. Jax bypassed the station's air filtration system while Maya and I planted a series of canisters at the base of the intake vents. They weren't filled with explosives. They were filled with a chemical catalyst I had spent weeks synthesizing, a compound that, when aerosolized, would react with the ambient haze, causing it to hyperconcentrate into a lethal, flesh-dissolving fog. We retreated to a safe distance and watched. The station's lights flickered as the catalyst was drawn into its life support. There were no screams, not that we could hear. The lights just went out, one by one. The hegemony would find the station inert. The crew inside little more than sludge in their pristine white suits. They would call it an environmental anomaly. A system malfunction. They wouldn't know it was us. Not yet. But as I watched the station go dark against the bruised twilight, I knew this was only the beginning. The council wanted to hide from the monsters. I would show them how to create them. The healer was dead, buried in the dust of the archive. All that was left was a promise, sworn on the silenced laughter of children, that the hegemony would learn to fear the ghosts they had made. The silence that followed our first strike was more unnerving than any battle. For a week, we listened to the hegemony's encrypted comms chatter, waiting for some sign that they knew, that they understood. But there was nothing. The official report, intercepted by Maya from a low-orbit data burst, listed the deaths at the atmospheric station as a catastrophic equipment failure due to unforeseen haze particle agglomeration. They had no idea they were being hunted. Their arrogance was a shield. But every shield has a weak point. The success, quiet as it was, changed us. We were no longer just survivors. We were a weapon. Word of what we'd done, whispered in the dark corners of our enclave, drew others to us. Not many, at first. A dozen hardened scavengers, a munitions expert who had lost his family in the first wave of the haze, a few desperate souls with nothing left but the fire in their eyes. We started calling ourselves the Ghosts, for we moved through the gray world they had made, unseen and unheard, leaving only questions in our wake. The council, however, saw our actions not as a victory, but as a reckless provocation. Their leader, an old politician named Marcus, who still wore the tattered remains of a pre-fall suit, summoned me to his chamber, a reinforced office in the deepest level of our subway station enclave. The air was stale with the smell of recycled air and fear. "You're going to get us all killed," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He gestured at a map of the city, littered with red markers indicating cleanser patrols. They left us alone because we were quiet. "You are screaming for their attention." I leaned over the map, my gaze cold. They left us alone because they thought we were vermin. Marcus. Harmless. They didn't leave the people at the archive alone. They didn't leave my brother alone. My voice dropped, the rage a low hum beneath the words. We've been dying quietly for a decade. For one, I'm done with being quiet. Survival isn't living. It's just a slower way to die. His face, already a network of deep lines, seemed to collapse further. And what is this vengeance? You think your anger can defeat their armies? They have orbital platforms, entire legions of cleansers. We have scavenged rifles and anger. I pointed to one of the red markers on the map. They also have supply lines. They have routines. They have arrogance. And we have the haze. They think it's their weapon. We're going to teach them it has a new master. I left him in his office, surrounded by his maps and his caution. I knew he wouldn't try to stop us. Not directly. He was a politician, and he saw the way the wind was blowing. The people were tired of hiding. They were hungry for a victory. Any victory, no matter how small. Jax became the heart of our new war. In a makeshift workshop lit by battery-powered LEDs, surrounded by salvaged circuitry and chemical tubs, he transformed my crude catalyst into a true weapon. He engineered small, pressure-activated canisters that could be triggered by a footstep or a timer. They were our version of landmines, but instead of shrapnel, they released a nearly invisible cloud of my refined compound. In the dense haze of the lower city, the effect was devastating. A single canister could turn a 10-meter radius into a death trap, the air itself becoming a corrosive agent that dissolved seals on environmental suits and then the flesh within. We called them breathers. We needed a bigger target, something they couldn't dismiss as a malfunction. Maya's scouting reports gave us one. A weekly convoy of 3 armored personnel carriers ran a supply route from the sealed Hegemony Citadel to an outlying research post, Sector Gamma. It always followed the same path, through a collapsed section of the I-9 expressway we called the Choke. It was a perfect ambush point, a concrete canyon of fallen overpasses and burnt-out vehicles. Planning the attack consumed me. I spent my waking hours studying maps, timing patrol routes, calculating the precise placement for each breather. The healer in me was truly gone, replaced by a tactician who thought in kill zones and lines of fire. The transformation was not without its cost. The 3 children from the archive were a constant presence, a living reminder of the stakes. The little girl with the rusty hair, Kala, would sometimes follow me, her gaze wide and questioning. One evening, as I was cleaning a salvaged pulse rifle, she approached me, holding out a small, polished piece of blue glass. "For luck," she whispered. I looked from the weapon in my hands, a tool of absolute destruction, to the simple, hopeful offering in hers. I saw Leo in her eyes, in that unshakable innocence the world had tried so hard to crush. My hands, stained with grease and chemical residue, felt clumsy and unclean as I took the glass from her. For a moment, I wanted to tell her to run, to get away from me, away from the man I was becoming. Instead, I just nodded, the gesture feeling hollow and false. "Thank you, Kala." I slipped the glass into my pocket, where it felt as heavy as a gravestone. The night of the ambush was unnaturally still. The haze hung thick in the choke, muffling all sound, turning the skeletal remains of cars into silent, hulking beasts. We were in position, 20 of us hidden among the rubble, a ghost army waiting for its moment. My pulse rifle felt cold and steady in my hands. The rage was still there, but it had been honed, chilled into a sharp, focused instrument. We heard the convoy before we saw it, the low growl of its engines echoing through the concrete canyon. 3 APCs, their white hulls looking spectral in the gloom, rolled into the choke with the easy confidence of predators who have never known fear. They passed the first tripwire. Jax gave the signal, a single click on the comms. The lead APC's front tires rolled directly over one of the breathers. There was no explosion, just a soft hiss, like air escaping a tire. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the seams on the vehicle's hull began to smoke. Rivets popped, and the armored plates warped as if under intense heat. The cleansers inside must have realized what was happening, but it was too late. The APC swerved, crashing into a concrete pylon, its lights flickering out. The other 2 vehicles ground to a halt, their hatches opening as cleansers poured out, rifles raised, their helmeted heads scanning the darkness. They walked right into the kill zone. We had planted a dozen breathers in a wide arc around the road. As the cleansers spread out, their boots found the pressure plates. Hissing sounds filled the air, and the haze around them seemed to shimmer and thicken. The first sign was their movements becoming sluggish, their armor frosting over as the catalyst ate at the seals. Then they began to stumble. One of them raised a hand to his helmet, a gesture of confusion, before collapsing. His suit didn't just fail, it deliquesced, the advanced polymer turning to a gray goo that sloughed off his bones. Within a minute, the entire patrol was down, dissolving silently into the dust. It was a horrifying, silent slaughter. We moved in, our own rebreathers protecting us from the lingering catalyst. We secured their weapons, their supplies, and a set of encrypted data slates that could give us insight into their operations. It was a treasure trove, but I needed something more. I needed to send a message. I walked to the lead APC, the one that had crashed. Using a can of emergency sealant from its own supply kit, I painted a symbol on its hull, a single, open hand, palm forward, with a hollow circle in its center, the hand of humanity, with a hole torn through it, the symbol of what they had taken from us. Let them see it. Let their commanders wonder what it means. Let them know that the vermin in the gray zones had grown teeth. We slipped back into the haze, leaving the silent, dissolving convoy as our calling card. When we returned to the enclave, the news of our victory spread like wildfire. The fear that had held our people in its grip for a decade began to crack, replaced by a dangerous, fragile hope. Marcus watched me from a distance, his face a mixture of terror and grudging respect. He knew, as I did, that the old world of hiding and surviving was over. We had screamed our defiance into the void. That night, crouched over the captured comms unit, listening to the frantic, panicked chatter from the hegemony citadel, I knew he was right to be afraid. The coded messages were replaced by a clear, system-wide broadcast in a cold, measured voice I had never heard before. It announced that a state of emergency had been declared for our entire sector. It spoke of a virulent, indigenous threat and the activation of a new countermeasure. The voice gave it a name that chilled me deeper than any haze ever could. The Ashen Protocol. They were no longer just weeding a garden. They were coming to burn the whole thing to the ground. The Ashen Protocol was not a whisper. It was a roar. 2 days after the broadcast, it arrived. We saw the first signs from our lookout posts, high in the skeletal remains of the gilded tower plumes of black smoke rising from the smaller scavenger settlements on the city's fringe. Through high-powered binoculars, we watched the new enemy. They weren't cleansers. Their suits were a matte, non-reflective black, and they moved with a predatory speed that was terrifyingly organic. They didn't carry pulse rifles, they carried incinerators, where the cleansers erased. These new soldiers the purifiers burned. They swept through the settlements, and whatever they didn't shoot, they set ablaze with torrents of liquid fire, turning ramshackle homes and their inhabitants into pillars of greasy smoke. They were the hegemony's answer to our defiance, a declaration that they would no longer tolerate even the idea of us. They were going to salt the earth. The fear that returned to the Enclave was a physical thing, a cold fog that seeped into every corner, thicker than the haze itself. The fragile hope we had kindled was extinguished, replaced by a frantic, finger-pointing terror. And all those fingers pointed at me. Marcus cornered me in the main common area, his face pale, his political caution replaced by raw, undisguised fury. This time, he wasn't alone. A crowd of residents, their faces a mixture of anger and despair, stood behind him. "This is your victory," he spat, his voice shaking. "You poked the beast, and now it's come to devour us all. The settlements at the Ashfield periphery are gone, hundreds dead, burned alive because of you." His words were lashes, and they found their mark not on my conscience, but on the resolve of the people around me. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "He's right," someone shouted. We were safe. We were quiet. I stood my ground, my gaze sweeping over their faces, seeing the same terror I had seen in the eyes of the children at the archive just before the cleansers came. "You weren't safe," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, cold and sharp. "You are dying on a schedule they set for you. You call what they did at Ashfield an answer to me. They've been doing that for 10 years. Just slower, just quieter. The only thing that's changed is now they're afraid. Now they know we can bleed." I turned my back on them and walked away, the weight of their fear a physical pressure. But behind me, I could feel a shift. My words hadn't won them all, but they had reached the ones who mattered, the ones who knew that a quiet death was still a death. The data slates we'd captured from the convoy were our only hope. In the low, flickering light of Jax's workshop, the three of us Jax, Maya, and I hunched over a salvaged terminal, sifting through layers of hegemony encryption. What we found was bigger than supply routes. It was a schematic of the entire haze network for our sector. The haze wasn't just a lingering cloud. It was actively maintained, replenished by a series of subterranean dispersal nodes that vented the weaponized nanoparticles into the atmosphere. The schematics showed the central node for our entire city grid, Substation Epsilon. It was located deep beneath what was once the city's financial district, a fortress of concrete and steel, the heart of the serpent. "If we could take this out," Jax murmured, his finger tracing the glowing lines on the screen. "It wouldn't stop the haze. Not completely, but it would cripple their ability to replenish it. The concentration would start to thin over months, maybe even years. It would be a wound they couldn't easily heal. It was more than a target. It was a chance to undo a piece of what they had done, to give the very air back to our children." But the station was deep in a red zone, an area of the city with haze concentration so high that not even the echoes could survive there for long. And the data showed it was guarded by a full garrison, not of cleansers, but of the new purifiers. A direct assault was suicide. We needed a distraction, something so massive it would pull the purifiers away from Epsilon, even for a few hours. The plan that formed in my mind was monstrous. I knew it the moment it surfaced, and I didn't flinch. West of the financial district was the concourse, a sprawling, multi-level plaza that had been a major evacuation point during the fall. It was now home to the largest herd of echoes in the city, thousands of them, shuffling in a silent, endless river of lost humanity. They were a force of nature, an obstacle that even cleanser patrols avoided. The hegemony's protocols are clear. I explained to Jax and Maya, my voice devoid of emotion. They prioritize the containment of mass echo congregations. They see it as a potential vector for mutation, a change in the haze. They'll respond to a significant anomaly there. Jax looked at me, his eyes wide. What kind of anomaly? I laid a canister on the table, larger than our standard breathers, filled with a new, highly unstable version of the catalyst. We don't create a kill zone, I said. We create a flash reaction. We'll use this to trigger a haze fire, a rapid, violent concentration of the particles into a corrosive storm. It won't last long, but it will register on every sensor they have as a full-scale biological event. It will draw every purifier in a 5-mile radius. Maya stared at the canister, then at me. There are thousands of them in the concourse, she said softly. They're not people anymore. Maya, I replied, the words tasting like ash. They're just echoes. We're trading ghosts to save the living. She didn't argue, but the look in her eyes was one I was starting to see everywhere, a questioning of the man I was becoming. The healer who had sworn to do no harm was now planning to weaponize the ghosts of the dead on a scale that was hard to comprehend. The operation was a descent into hell, while one team, led by Maya, prepped the catalyst at the edge of the concourse. My team, a dozen of us, including Jax, began our infiltration towards Substation Epsilon. We moved through sewers and forgotten service tunnels, the air growing thick and acrid, our rebreathers working overtime. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of toxic water and the rasp of our own breathing. We were 2 hours into the approach when the ground shuddered. A low, tearing sound vibrated through the concrete, and a wave of pressure washed over us. On the comms, Maya's voice was strained. It's done. The sky over the concourse it's on fire. I could picture it a swirling vortex of gray energy, the air itself turning into an acid that would scour the flesh from the shuffling herds. I felt a pang, not of guilt, but of a cold, hollow certainty. It was the price. We pushed on. The entrance to Epsilon was exactly as the schematics had described, a massive, blast-proof door set into the foundation of a collapsed bank. 2 purifiers stood guard, their black armor seeming to drink the dim light. Their incinerators were slung across their backs, their helmets fixed forward, unmoving. We didn't try to fight them. Jax used a salvage sonic emitter to create a high-frequency vibration against a nearby support pillar, a ghost sound that drew their attention for the barest of seconds. In that moment, we slipped past them into the maintenance shaft. The inside of the station was a sterile nightmare, white walls, humming machinery, and the pervasive, antiseptic smell of the hegemony. It was a world away from the dust and ruin we called home. Patrols of purifiers marched through the corridors with chilling precision. We moved like phantoms, sticking to the shadows. Our scavenged gear a stark contrast to their pristine technology. My medical knowledge became a weapon once more. I knew where the cervical vertebrae were, the exact point at the base of the skull where a blade could sever a spinal cord before a sound could be made. I killed 2 purifiers that way. their powerful bodies dropping silently in the dark. I felt their lives end at the tip of my knife, and the only thing I felt was the cold calculus of the mission. We reached the primary dispersal chamber, a vast, cylindrical room filled with humming conduits and a central reactor core that pulsed with a sickly green light. This was the heart. Jax got to work immediately, prying open a control panel and beginning the delicate process of wiring our explosives directly into the reactor's coolant system. As he worked, I stood watch, pulse rifle ready. The weight of what we were doing settled on me. This was it. This was the blow from which they might not recover. A voice crackled over my comm. It was Maya. They're coming back. The concourse anomaly is fading faster than we expected. They've rerouted 2 full squads from the perimeter. They're heading for Epsilon. You have 10 minutes. My blood ran cold. Jax. How much longer? I need 15, he hissed, sweat beading on his forehead as he spliced wires. The failsafes are a nightmare. We didn't have 15 minutes. I made the decision in a heartbeat. Set it for 10. A direct overload. Forget the coolant system. Just wire it to the primary power conduit. It won't be as big, but it will be enough to rupture the core. It'll blow the whole level sky high the second I connect the detonator, he protested. We won't get clear. Just do it, I roared. As he frantically rewired the charges, I could hear the rhythmic clank of armored boots approaching. They were here. The explosives were set. A crude but powerful package wired into the station's very heart. Jax looked at me, his face grim. It's a dead man's switch. We arm it. We have 60 seconds. There's no way we make it to the shaft. Before I could answer, a side door slid open and a squad of purifiers stormed in. The firefight was instant and brutal. Blue energy bolts from our rifles met torrents of fire from theirs. The chamber became a maelstrom of light and noise. One of my men screamed as he was engulfed in flames. Another was cut down by a precise volley of pulse fire. We were outgunned, outnumbered. Jax was hit, a pulse round catching him in the leg, sending him sprawling. I dragged him behind the reactor core, laying down, suppressing fire. There was only one way out. Maya. I said into my comm, my voice strained. Get the others out. We're not making it. Then I looked at the detonator in Jax's trembling hand. Give it to me. He shook his head, his face contorted in pain. No. I'll do it. You have to get out. You have to lead them. That's an order. Jax. I grabbed the detonator from him. Now go. I helped him to his feet, shoving him toward a ventilation duct we had marked on the schematics. It'll take you to the sublevels. Go. The remaining ghosts laid down a wall of cover fire, a final desperate act of defiance. As they dragged Jax away, I turned to face the advancing purifiers. The detonator clutched in my hand. I thought of Leo, of Kala's blue glass in my pocket, of the children at the archive. I thought of the healer I used to be. The purifiers raised their weapons. I thumbed the arming switch. The timer began its final, silent countdown from 60 seconds. I met their blank, helmeted visors with a grim smile. The council wanted to hide from the monsters. I had become one. And now, I was going to show them how a monster dies. I didn't die. The 60 seconds evaporated in a blur of motion and instinct. As the purifiers advanced, their incinerators roaring to life, I dove sideways, not away from them, but toward the reactor core. I jammed the detonator into a crevice between two coolant pipes, armed and active, its red light a furious, beating heart. Then, with the last of my strength, I hurled myself through a shimmering energy field that cordoned off a maintenance conduit. The field sizzled against my back, a wave of agony that momentarily blacked out my vision. But I was through. The last thing I saw before the world turned white was the look of confusion on the lead purifier's helmet as he realized what the blinking red light meant. The explosion wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow that hammered me into the far wall of the conduit. The entire structure of Substation Epsilon screamed as it tore itself apart. The concussion wave that followed was a giant's fist, punching the air from my lungs and sending me tumbling through the darkness of the narrow tunnel like a rag doll. Consciousness came and went in jagged, searing flashes. I remember the groan of collapsing metal, the hiss of ruptured pipes, and the suffocating dust that tasted of ozone and burnt concrete. I was broken, my body a symphony of pain. My left arm was bent at an angle that wasn't natural, and every breath was a fresh torment from what felt like a dozen broken ribs. But I was alive. I was a ghost in the machine I had just destroyed. For days, I drifted in and out of a delirious haze in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city. I survived on stimpaks from my medkit and the foul, brackish water that dripped from the ceiling. My thoughts were a fractured mess, my own memories blurring with the ghosts of the people I had lost and the people I had killed. I saw Leo's vacant eyes in the darkness. I heard the screams from the concourse, a sound I had created. I saw the dissolving bodies of the cleansers in the choke, a testament to my cold, calculated rage. The healer in me, the one I thought long dead, surfaced in these fevered moments, whispering accusations in the dark. How many had I killed to get here? How many lives, echo or otherwise, had I spent like currency for this one victory? The man who had once sworn an oath to preserve life had become its most efficient destroyer. I had become the haze, scouring away the humanity in myself to fight the monsters outside. But what happens when you win? What is left when the fire burns out? Was I fighting for a future? Or was I just an engine of destruction? A man who had forgotten how to do anything but burn the world down eventually. The fever broke, leaving me weak but lucid, driven by a primal need to know, to see the consequences of my actions. I began the agonizing journey back to the surface. It took me a week, crawling through collapsed tunnels and navigating flooded sewer systems. When I finally emerged, pushing aside a rusted manhole cover, I was in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The haze was different. It was still there, a permanent gray veil, but it was thinner, less oppressive. Patches of pale, watery sunlight broke through, something I hadn't seen in years. Birds, real birds, chirped from the ledge of a ruined building, their song a sound from a forgotten world. The air still carried a metallic tang, but it didn't burn the lungs in the same way. It was working. The heart of the serpent was broken, and its poison was thinning. The victory was real. The cost was real, too. As I stumbled through the streets, I saw the evidence of the hegemony's fury. Entire blocks had been systematically purged. The black scorch marks of the purifier's incinerators painted across every building. The Ashen Protocol had been brutally effective. But there was something else, too. On a wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, was the symbol I had painted on the APC, the open hand with the circle in its center, the ghost hand. It was a sign of defiance, a symbol of our nascent rebellion. We were no longer just whispers. We had a name. It took me another 2 weeks to find my way back to our enclave. I was a wreck, gaunt and scarred, my arm in a crude sling I'd fashioned from my torn jacket. The guards at the perimeter didn't recognize me at first. When they did, their reaction wasn't one of celebration. It was one of awe and fear. They looked at me as if I were a ghost, a legend returned from the dead. The news of my survival spread through the station like a shockwave. I found Maya in the med bay, overseeing the care of the wounded from the Epsilon raid. Jax was there, his leg bandaged, but alive. When she saw me, her face, etched with exhaustion, broke with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. She ran to me, throwing her arms around me, then recoiling as I winced in pain. "We thought you were dead," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The whole station went up. There was no way. There was a way, I said, my voice a rough croak. "How many did we lose?" Her face fell. 7. We lost 7, including the ones who covered your escape. The names hung in the air between us, a fresh litany for me to carry. The Enclave had changed. The Council, led by Marcus, was gone. In the power vacuum left by my presumed death, and fueled by the success of the Epsilon strike, the Ghosts had become the de facto leaders. But it was a fractured leadership. Without me, the single-minded engine of the rebellion, factions had formed. There was Maya, who argued for a new strategy using the thinning haze as an opportunity to build, to fortify, to create a true sanctuary for the survivors who were now flocking to our banner from all over the city. She wanted to turn our victory into a foundation for a future. Then there was another faction, led by a hard-eyed survivor named Kale, one of the men who had been with me from the beginning. Kyle saw the thinning haze not as a chance for peace, but as a strategic advantage. He preached a gospel of total war. He wanted to take the fight to the hegemony, to strike at their other cities, to burn their citadel to the ground. He had taken my rage and amplified it, turning it into a brutal, uncompromising ideology. He saw me not just as a leader, but as a messiah of vengeance. "You showed us the way," he said to me, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire, in front of a crowd of his followers. "You taught us that the only language they understand is pain. We crippled them. Now we must kill them. All of them. We must do to their world what they did to ours." I stood between them, a ghost torn between two futures. Maya's path was one of healing, of rebuilding the world, and perhaps of rebuilding the man I once was. Kale's path was the one I had carved, a road of blood and fire that led to a final, apocalyptic confrontation. And as I looked at the faces of the people, the hopeful, the desperate, the battle-scarred, I realized they weren't just looking at me for leadership. They were looking at me to define what humanity would become. Would we be the builders, or the destroyers, the healers, or the monsters? The choice felt impossibly heavy. The part of me that was still a doctor, the part that still remembered Kala's blue glass, yearned for Maya's peace. I wanted to see a world where children didn't have to learn the weight of a pulse rifle, where the sky wasn't a constant, gray reminder of loss. But the other part of me, the part forged in the fire of the archive, the part that had stood over the ruined body of the cleanser commander, knew Kale was right about one thing: the hegemony would not stop. They were a wounded beast. And a wounded beast is at its most dangerous. Leaving them alive was a gamble, a risk that our children would have to pay for later. The breaking point came in the form of a transmission. Our comm specialists, using the tech we'd salvaged, intercepted a high-level hegemony dispatch. It wasn't encrypted. They wanted us to hear it. The same cold, measured voice from the Ashen Protocol broadcast announced that the Epsilon incident had been contained. It declared our rebellion a terminal contagion and authorized the final solution, the sterilization mandate. They were preparing to deploy a new form of the haze, a variant that wasn't designed to erase minds, but to break down organic matter on a cellular level. It wouldn't leave echoes, it would leave nothing. They were going to turn the entire city, and everyone in it, into dust. The broadcast ended with a date, a deadline. We had 1 month. 1 month until they wiped us from existence. The debate was over. Maya's dream of peace died in the silence that followed the transmission. There was no rebuilding a world that was about to be unmade. Kyle's followers roared, their calls for war now sounding less like fanaticism and more like grim necessity. I looked at Maya, and in her eyes, I saw not defeat, but a terrible, shared understanding. We had no choice. We had to fight. But the question remained, how do you fight an enemy that is willing to destroy the entire world just to kill you? My answer was simple. You don't just fight them. You become their apocalypse. You take the fire they want to unleash on you, and you turn it back on them, 100-fold. I stood before my people, the returned ghost, the monster they had been waiting for. The time for whispers was over. The time for healing was a luxury we couldn't afford. They want to turn our home into a tomb, I said, my voice echoing through the vast subway station. They want to erase our names, our history, our children. We have 1 month to teach them the true meaning of the word erased. We will not wait for the storm to break. We will become the storm. We are going to their citadel, and we are going to burn it to the ground. The month we had was not a reprieve. It was a crucible. The knowledge of the sterilization mandate forged us into something new, something harder. The factions dissolved. The arguments ceased. Maya's pragmatism and Kyle's fury merged with my own cold resolve, creating a single, unified weapon pointed at the heart of the hegemony. We were no longer ghosts. We were the storm, and we were coming for them. Our plan was born of utter desperation, a final, suicidal gamble. We couldn't fight their legions. We couldn't breach their orbital defenses. And we couldn't survive the new haze. So we chose a target that bypassed all of that. The hegemony citadel wasn't just a fortress. It was a sealed arcology, a self-sustaining city with its own atmosphere, water, and power. That was its strength, and that was its fatal weakness. Using the schematics from Epsilon, Jax and his team of engineers founded the primary atmospheric intake and filtration hub, located at the Citadel's lowest, most vulnerable level, bordering the contaminated gray zone. It was their connection to the outside world, the lung that allowed their pristine city to breathe. If we could poison the lung, the body would die. My new catalyst was the poison. I spent every waking hour in Jax's workshop, surrounded by volatile chemicals and the acrid smell of ozone, pushing my knowledge to its absolute limit. I wasn't creating a weapon to dissolve armor or flesh anymore. I was creating a plague. The compound I synthesized was a self-replicating nanoparticle designed to bond with the specific oxygen-nitrogen mixture of the Citadel's filtered air. Once introduced into their sealed environment via the intake hub, it would spread silently, invisibly, through their ventilation systems. It was harmless at first, undetectable, but it was programmed with a trigger. The data slates had given us access to the hegemony's emergency broadcast frequencies. Once the catalyst had saturated their atmosphere, a process we calculated would take 12 hours, a specific, high-frequency signal from us would activate it. The activation would cause a cascading chemical reaction, turning the very air they breathed into a neurotoxin so potent it would kill in seconds. We were going to turn their sanctuary into a gas chamber. There was no moral debate, no hesitation. They had sentenced our world to death, and we were simply returning the verdict. The journey to the Citadel was a final pilgrimage through the ruins of our world. We moved as a single force, a ragged army of 200 souls, carrying our vengeance and our makeshift apocalypse. We used the thinned haze as our shield, the familiar gray fog now a comforting cloak. The children, including Kala, were with us. They were the reason we were doing this, a living, breathing reminder of the future the hegemony wanted to extinguish. Leaving them behind was not an option. There would be nothing to come back to. I found myself watching Kala during our rare moments of rest. She didn't smile as much anymore. Her eyes, once so bright, now held the quiet, weary gravity of an old soldier. One evening, as I stared into the embers of a small, smokeless fire, she came and sat beside me. She didn't speak, just held out her hand. In it was the piece of blue glass she had given me, the one I had carried since the ambush at the choke. I must have lost it during the explosion at Epsilon. She had found it in the rubble of my gear when the others returned. I took it from her. The smooth, cool glass, a stark contrast to the calloused, scarred landscape of my hand. "It's for the luck you still need," she said, her voice barely a whisper. In that moment, the weight of what I was about to do, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the death I was about to unleash, threatened to crush me. I was going to kill millions. Soldiers, civilians, leaders, and children. Children just like her, who had the misfortune of being born on the other side of the wall. Was I any different from the cleanser commander in the archive, raising his weapon to silence the laughter of innocence? The healer I had buried so long ago screamed in the silence of my soul. I looked at Kala, at her trusting face, and the monster I had become recoiled. But then I looked past her, at the gray, dying world around us, at the faces of my people, etched with loss and a desperate, final hope. The hegemony had left us no other path. Mercy was a luxury for a world that was not on fire. I closed my hand around the blue glass, its sharp edge digging into my palm. "Thank you, Kala," I said, my voice hoarse. "We're going to need it." The assault on the intake hub was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. We struck under the cover of a dust storm, using sonic charges to blow the armored doors and breather canisters to neutralize the purifier guards before they could even raise an alarm. While Kale and his fighters secured the perimeter, Jax, Maya, and I moved into the heart of the facility. It was a cavernous space, filled with the roar of giant turbines and a forest of filtration conduits. This was it, the lung. Jax worked with a feverish intensity, bypassing security protocols and forcing open the primary dispersal valve. My team brought forward the payload, a dozen large, pressurized containers of my self-replicating plague. We connected them to the valve, our hands steady despite the tremor of adrenaline running through us. "It's done," Jack said, stepping back. "Once we open this, there's no closing it. The Citadel's air system will draw it all in within 10 minutes. I gave the order." With a deafening hiss, our vengeance poured into the veins of their world. We retreated, leaving a timer to seal the valve behind us, and melted back into the gray zone. Then, we waited. The next 12 hours were the longest of my life. We found shelter in the ruins of a pre-fall cathedral, its skeletal arches reaching toward the gray sky like praying hands. We huddled together, a small island of humanity in a sea of silence, waiting for our world to either be saved or damned. I sat apart from the others, the small data slate that held the trigger in my hand. It was just a single command, a simple string of code, but it held the power of a god, the power to extinguish a civilization. I thought of my brother, Leo. I had set out on this path to avenge him, to give his stolen life some meaning. But what meaning was there in this mass murder genocide I had wanted them to fear the ghosts they had made? But, in the end, I had simply become the most terrifying ghost of all. Maya found me as the 12th hour approached. She sat beside me, her pulse rifle resting across her knees. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, she said, "I saw the way you looked at Kala. The healer is still in there, isn't he?" I didn't answer, my gaze fixed on the countdown timer on the slate. "This doesn't have to be the end," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "It can be a beginning. We can use this as leverage. Force them to the table. Demand a truce, a new world. We don't have to become them." Her words were a lifeline, a desperate, beautiful appeal to a part of me I thought was dead. For a fleeting, heart-wrenching moment, I considered it a world without more killing, a world where I could put down the weapon and maybe, just maybe, learn to be a healer again. Then, the cathedral's ancient foundations groaned. A deep, rhythmic tremor started, growing steadily stronger. It was the unmistakable sound of breaching charges. On the horizon, against the bruised twilight, a line of black-suited figures appeared, their incinerators already lit, turning the gray dusk into a flickering orange hell. The sterilization mandate had arrived ahead of schedule. They hadn't come to negotiate. They hadn't come to offer terms. They had come to burn us all. There was no more choice. There was no more debate. There was only the cold, hard certainty of survival. I looked at Maya, the hope in her eyes dying as she saw the approaching flames. I looked at Kyle, who met my gaze with a grim, final nod. I looked at Kala, who was clutching the tattered picture book of the blue bird, her small face a mask of terror. My promise to the dead, my duty to the living, it all came down to this single, terrible moment. I raised the data slate. My thumb hovered over the activation key. I was not a hero. I was not a savior. I was a monster forged in the ashes of an orphanage, a healer who had learned to kill, and I would damn my soul to give them a sunrise. I pressed the key. There was no sound, no flash of light, just a silent signal, screaming across the wasteland into the heart of their pristine world. For a moment, nothing happened. The line of purifiers continued its relentless advance. Then, in the distance, the Citadel's lights began to flicker. One by one, they went out, plunging the monolithic structure into an absolute, final darkness. We saw no fire, heard no screams, just a vast, silent tomb standing against the sky. The advancing purifiers faltered, their movements becoming confused, disorganized. Their comms must have turned to static, their commanders to silent corpses. They were cut off. A headless serpent, our war, which had begun in the quiet dust of erased memories, ended in the profound silence of a world holding its breath. We had won. As my people rose to their feet, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. I did not join them. I stood alone, the empty data slate in my hand, and looked at the dead city on the horizon. The haze was already starting to feel thinner. I felt the blue glass in my pocket, its edges sharp against my skin. The healer was still in there, buried deep beneath the ash and the rage, and he knew that the war was over. But my penance had just begun. Humanity had risen, but the monster who had carried it to victory would forever walk in the gray shadows of the world he had both saved and utterly destroyed.